Hi. Castlevania means a great many different things, just like other Konami properties. Even if you narrow it down to Castlevania video games, or even Castlevania 2D action platformers, there are still two distinct groups of games there, separated by genre. This video is about the Igavania or Metroidvania genre of Castlevania games. A bit over a decade after the release of the first Castlevania in 1986, one new game, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, sought to evolve the 2D action platformer Castlevania formula into something completely new. The developers of Symphony of the Night were successful in this, which led to an early 2000s jam-packed with Castlevania releases in this style. We even got a new one in 2019, and although that one isn't Castlevania by name, it was created by many of the same people, which definitely counts. In this video, I chronologically revisit these Castlevania games and explain their development circumstances and how cool they are. I do think it's an interesting subgenre of Castlevania, which raises such questions as, why are there so many of these? And, are these games even good? I examine weird game mechanics and systems, speedrunning, randomizers, and even what the creator of Cookie Clicker rightfully understands as the most important part of this series, great pixel art of food. Here is how I would have ranked these 8 games before making this series. This is what I think of them now. And here's what I think of my chapter segments of this video. The parts of this video for each game were originally separate videos, here combined and remastered for convenience's sake. You will find YouTube chapters for each of the 8 games. Feel free to watch them out of order. My 2 favorite parts are the Castlevania Order of Ecclesia part and the Bloodstained Ritual of the Night part. So what makes a Castlevania game a Castlevania game? Who gets to decide what is and isn't Castlevania? First, let's look at Symphony of the Night. Castlevania Symphony of the Night released in 1997 for the Sony PlayStation. The game is an action platformer about the exploration of a giant demonic castle, combat against enemies, and finding items. It is, at time of writing, ranked 34th best game of all time on the Glitchwave game charts, which is bonkers. As a direct sequel to the previous Castlevania game and evolution of the series, the plan was to extend the playtime of this game by giving it a big world, an RPG leveling system, and loads of items to collect. The developer's goal was to fill this Castlevania chock full of stuff, which meant expanding gameplay systems, number of enemies, number of weapons, sub-weapons, traversable space, everything. Soten does one really neat thing in its pursuit of having a longer runtime than past Castlevanias. When a player is done with the game, when they're satisfied, is truly up to them. If they want more content out of Symphony of the Night, it's there. There are several distinct layered goalposts of 100% completion. Maybe, for you, completing the map is 100% completion. Or maybe you'd want to fill out the bestiary by killing one of each enemy. Symphony of the Night can turn into a 100-hour-plus long game if the player chooses to complete the bestiary by finding out what every rare drop is from every enemy. Or maybe some player out there wants to max out the power level of the Muramasa, a main weapon that grows stronger with the amount of blood it absorbs. The most unique part of Soten, though, is its fighting game motion inputs. In the previous game, Rondo of Blood, the unlockable bonus character Maria had one secret motion input move: up, quarter circle forward, plus attack. Symphony of the Night follows that up by having many fighting game motion input moves, which are called spells and drain the magic meter. The spells are a really weird augmentation to the combat system that new players are likely to ignore almost completely, though there are so many that it's not uncommon to accidentally trigger a spell. So, player character Alucard Castlevania ends up being this character whose basic functions are simple to pick up, but who also has this unbelievable hidden depth built in for players yearning for a level of mastery. There's complicated movement tech. There are special move homing missile attacks. There's a special move that damages the entire screen and heals Alucard. Fighting game inputs in single-player Metroidvania games like this are still mostly a rarity. When Alucard is playable again in Dawn of Sorrow as a bonus character, the developers did not bother re-implementing most of his spells. Even in games partly inspired by Soten, the use of motion inputs is usually relegated to some secret technique that the player isn't supposed to learn about until almost at the end of a game. The high jump ability given by the Gravity Boots relic is really useful, but could go completely unused by new players due to its input requirement, a snappy down-up plus jump. The motion inputs bled out of the spells system and crossed into the game's functions that really could have just been mapped to one button. Symphony of the Night's bonus character, Richter, also got some motion inputs. He gets his own version of the high jump with the same motion input as Alucard's, and an invincible air dash attack, which uses the same motion input as Maria's from Rondo of Blood. Richter does not use the R and L buttons to activate transformations like Alucard, so those buttons just sit there. You can't map Richter's special moves to these empty buttons. You just need to master the motion inputs to use the moves. There are 3 different versions of Symphony of the Night, and 2 of them, the 2 that are not the PlayStation version, have different playable Marias. The first one, in the Saturn version, has her own full set of motion inputs. This Saturn Maria is, by the way, the only reason to play the Saturn version. It's bad. In this game about finding cool items and then opening the menu to check what they do, opening and closing the menu takes 5 years. This pause menu is where the map screen lives in the Saturn version too. The best part about the weird motion inputs is that skillful play feels rewarding and is rewarded. Soten has both a healthy speedrunning scene and a really cool randomizer with all sorts of options for what kind of Symphony of the Night you might want to play. The randomizer even has presets for casual runs, so Soten Rando can be enjoyed both casually and speedrunually. A fundamental part of the most technical side of Symphony of the Night is its bat dash for Alucard. One of the most finicky motion input moves, it's a full hold jump, up, circle from up to backward to down to forward, release jump that makes Alucard in bat form careen across the screen, completely invulnerable and becoming one of the most powerful attacks in the game. What's more, in the PlayStation version and PSP/Requiem version, there is a short window when you can perform this input again to chain the move into itself.
Just don't choke.
This hard-to-pull-off move goes so fast that it's everywhere in speedruns and randomizer races, which are often played by speedrunners for fun.
I'm fine with this.
I have played over 50 hours of Symphony of the Night in my life, and I've only managed to chain this air dash move into itself, like, twice? In the Saturn version, for some reason this move was overhauled to chain into itself forever, until you either hit a wall or run out of magic juice. This weird move that most players of Soten will never even perform is incredible. Most players wouldn't even see it unless they tune into a speedrunning marathon or look up speedruns on their own. And speaking of packing as much as possible into Symphony of the Night, how did the rest of that go? Remember the bloodthirsty Muramasa? There's a game system for how much particle effect blood splatter comes in contact with Alucard, built only for a spell effect and this one sword, which itself is a rare drop from one enemy. So many weapons have simple fighting game inputs of their own, unique special moves tied to individual weapons. One sword, the Jewel Sword, has a quarter circle forward plus attack that throws coins on the ground that don't even do anything at all. To get this sword, you have to break 2 secret walls, run across the floor of this secret area as a wolf, then go backward, hugging the ceiling of this area as a bat, and that makes the otherwise inaccessible Jewel Sword room open up. You can make Alucard a watermelon. You can make him Hatsune Miku. The Dark Shield is not Dark Element. The Dark Blade is also not Dark Element. The Saturn Soten devs drew a whole new set of Richter sprites that better reflect his new design, since his old in-game sprites were all modeled after his Rondo of Blood appearance. These new Richter sprites never returned, because they are not good. Even playable Richter mode in the Saturn version uses his old sprites. But wait, there's a secret code to play as Longcoat Richter. It's hold L, R, up, and A, which selects Richter, then continue holding up, let go of L and R, and hold C with up to play as Saturn Coat Richter. If Alucard falls asleep in a chair, the second fairy familiar cut from the international version of the PlayStation release, but present in all other releases, sings Alucard a lullaby, which is sort of a pop ballad arrangement of the track Lost Painting.
No more dreams to dream about, so
Pile of seas.
Castlevania Circle of the Moon released in 2001 as a launch title for the Game Boy Advance. Being a launch title made by a third party means first and foremost that this game was rushed. This is something we'll see continue throughout this series. Circle is the only game in this list developed not by Koji Igarashi and his team at Konami Computer Entertainment Tokyo, but instead by Konami Computer Entertainment Kobe. This was nothing new for the Castlevania series. In fact, Konami's unrelated subsidiaries all putting their own spins on Castlevania is why about half of the Castlevania games in the first 7 years of the series are all retellings and reinterpretations of Castlevania 1. Okay, so what track record does KCEK have with Castlevania? Before Circle, they developed Castlevania 64 and its expansion, Legacy of Darkness. Alright. Circle of the Moon's greatest weakness is that it's a little obtuse and a little stiff. This stiffness came out of a seemingly genuine attempt to combine gameplay styles of classic Castlevania with the more fluid and already popular Symphony of the Night. In 2001, this attempt was received well, selling over 1 million copies worldwide and reviewing favorably. In current year, newer Castlevania fans who purchase the Advance Collection just to play Aria of Sorrow will find Circle of the Moon harder to get into. And that's why the majority of this segment will now be about how to enjoy Circle of the Moon. Circle is really cool and absolutely worth playing. Now, the protagonist, Nathan Graves, does come to you on the box art already yossified, but in-game he isn't cool right away. You'll need to walk really slowly through a few rooms to reach the dash boots, which allow you to Kirby dash. Before that point though, just slide. Sliding in this game usually does the same damage as a whip attack, and with enough patience, sliding can do double the amount of damage as a gunshot. The other vitally important thing right at the start of the game is to kill enough Skeleton Bomber and Bonehead enemies to get randomly dropped Mercury and Salamander cards. The random number generator can, if it feels like it, make this take way longer than it's supposed to. With both of these cards, you now have access to your first taste of this game's magic system. Combine 2 cards and activate with the L button. Every combination has a different effect. The enemies that drop these random cards are announced to the player by default thanks to a new feature M2 added in the Advance Collection. But even better than that, with 2 cards you actually have access to the entirety of the magic system thanks to a really helpful oversight. When you press L to activate your card combo, the game world freezes for a bit, plays a sound effect, and Nathan undergoes a power-up animation where he starts to glow. This animation lasts 51 frames, almost a whole second. During this time, if you pause the game and change either or both of your cards, the activation still happens even though you don't have those cards. I cannot overstate how important this feature is for a first playthrough, or just for one's enjoyment of the game in general. It's fun to experiment and see what you can find, but you can also simply look up a chart to see what's possible. The whole map of Circle appears slightly larger than Symphony's map, but unlike Symphony, Circle only has one giant castle map, not 2. Speaking of Symphony of the Night, Circle has its own interesting New Game Plus content. Instead of having different playable characters like every other Igavania game, Circle instead unlocks character classes a la an RPG for beating the game. Beating the normal mode, which has Nathan's class labeled as Vampire Killer, unlocks Magician mode, where Nathan's stats are awful except for his magic, and all magic cards are unlocked from the start. Magician mode is a worthwhile challenge even if you used the card swapping trick to explore the magic system in the Vampire Killer playthrough. The 5 total character classes each make for fun playthroughs, but the most jarring thing is that there is a whole section of the castle map that realistically only one character class, the last unlocked one, Thief Mode, can visit. The Battle Arena is an area of the castle with 17 enemy-filled rooms where your magic meter is constantly drained. It's kind of an absurd challenge. Do you want to collect all the cards the legitimate way? 2 of the cards are random drops from enemies at the very end of this gauntlet. And the random number generator can simply decide to not give you these cards, meaning you'd have to go through the whole Battle Arena again. The Thief Mode playthrough is the only one with access to not only the best armor, which are all rare enemy drops, but also plenty of randomly dropped health potions and magic potions. If you use a magic restoring item in the battle arena, you can use some magic before it quickly drains away, which is near required for getting through the battle arena. Considering a fair amount of the player base of this game will want to get 100% map completion, it's wild that the battle arena is so effective at shutting down that desire. So that's Circle of the Moon. It's a weird one. I like it. Give it a try, especially if you own it but haven't yet. If you have played it, try the randomizer. It's a lot of fun. Harmony of Dissonance released in 2002 for the Game Boy Advance. Here's something weird Maxim, the second playable character, can do. When you walk with the left or right button, the player character in Harmony has some simulated momentum. Upon releasing a directional button, instead of coming to a dead stop, they continue moving for a short time. This adds to a feeling of weight, which is satisfying to control. Curiously though, the way this change from moving to stopping was implemented in this game has seriously weird consequences. Velocity is not decreased, but instead, negative velocity is added to smooth the time between moving and stopping. Right after a movement button is released, during this spurt of added negative velocity, let's backdash. Backdashing is weird too. You'd think that a backdash state might set a specific velocity for the player character, but instead, it's additive. This backdash is now extra fast just from the act of coming to a complete stop from walking. Normally, friction from the ground or the air would bring velocity back to within normal limits, but if we do these motions at a ledge, we can use a normal attack immediately upon leaving the ledge with the dash momentum. Attacking in the air in Harmony has its own quirk, which is that it freezes horizontal momentum in place for the duration of the attack. So suddenly, we've built up a lot of speed and managed to freeze that value for a while. Maxim can clip into walls, zipping him above them. In rooms like this, you can explore several different places where you might end up. Almost every save room in Harmony is suitable for zipping Maxim into walls, finding yourself in seemingly random, distant locations half the game world away. Here's what my map screen looked like at the end of a recent Maxim playthrough, where I zipped him around for fun almost everywhere I could. Using more complicated methods, Harmony's main character, Juste, can also exploit momentum quirks to zip through the game's areas. And speaking of the game's areas, this game has 2 castles again, just like Symphony of the Night. Harmony's most unique feature lies in the way that these castles are traversed through a playthrough. In Symphony of the Night, you basically progress through the normal castle and then tackle the inverted castle. But in Harmony, normal progression in the game includes warp rooms that whisk Juste away to far-off, seemingly disconnected locations. When you reach the halfway-ish point of the game by reaching the rightmost part of the castle, Death reveals in a cutscene that Juste had already seen certain parts of both castles, A side and B side. The only intended way to progress in the game sees Juste snaking around between the 2 castles in order to find all the necessary items to proceed. The game utilizes 2 identically shaped castles to double the combat variety. The 2 sides to one room feature completely different enemy encounters, including 19 boss fights spread across the 2 castles. Harmony certainly prides itself on having a lot of boss encounters. The game's opening makes sure to show off its fancy multiple sprite puppeteering to make giant bosses. Symphony of the Night also had a few enemies rendered in this way, but in Harmony it comes off as charmingly treasure game for the Mega Drive, or Castlevania Bloodlines. Fancy graphics come at a cost on the Game Boy Advance though. All computation power on the Game Boy Advance happens in its CPU. The GBA's 32-bit CPU is a serious step up from the hardware running pretty much any previous handheld gaming system, even including the Sega Nomad, which is just a Sega Mega Drive running on battery power. The GBA's CPU includes all of the GBA's sound hardware embedded in it, which means that the CPU can be more accurately described as an SoC, or system on a chip, since, well, it does nearly everything. The one major dilemma of the GBA's chipset is that with the one main CPU delivering all of the nearly everything, developers often had to choose between making their games graphically impressive, having clean-sounding audio, or trying to strike a balance between the 2. The Castlevania trilogy on Game Boy Advance can actually be used as a full example of these 3 options. For an even more intensified exhibit of these 3 Game Boy Advance performance outcomes, sounding impressive, looking impressive, and a balanced approach, check out Mother 3, The King of Fighters EX, Neo Blood, and Drill Dozer, respectively. This is the case because rendering more graphics on the screen costs CPU cycles. Crunching the data for high-quality sound samples costs CPU cycles. And the GBA's CPU only has so many cycles to go around, especially when nearly all GBA games target a refresh rate of 60 frames per second. With Harmony of Dissonance and its fancy Mega Drive-like boss fights, serious compromises had to be made. Fewer CPU cycles delegated to sound samples meant that much of the background music had to accommodate the main instruments being simple, 8-bit style wave generation sounds that the GBA could produce in its sleep. Soshiro Hokai is responsible for almost all of Harmony's soundtrack and did fantastic work with the challenge at hand. The compositions are jazzy, spooky, and unnerving in a way that really brings this Castlevania to life, despite the extreme sound limitations. And that's Harmony of Dissonance, one of the least popular games in this set, and sure, I can see why, but there's still a lot of fun to be had. Try the randomizer. It has settings to shuffle the entrances to areas, which can be a real nightmare. Harmony of Dissonance, except you have to take notes on how to get anywhere. Castlevania Aria of Sorrow released in 2003 for the Game Boy Advance. Aria is so good. It's the refinement of every game prior. The previous 3 games, Harmony of Dissonance, Circle of the Moon, and Symphony of the Night, all had heart counters for ammo as well as magic meters. Aria of Sorrow simplifies by combining these resources. Hearts drop from candles that refill your magic meter if it's not full. When it is full, candles don't need to drop hearts at all, so starting in Aria, candles now drop money in this case. The elegance of this system is the type of thing that Aria is just full of. And it sure beats the old system from Symphony and Harmony, where some candles drop hearts and others drop money. In those games and Circle, some candles drop Castlevania sub-weapons too, but Aria's candles don't need to, thanks to the main new game system in Aria. Normal sub-weapons are gone, and in their place are enemy souls. These souls drop from enemies randomly, with each enemy having its own arbitrarily designed soul drop likelihood. These games are about wandering around, slaying monsters, and finding items to progress, and Aria's soul system does wonders to bring together the monster slaying and item finding aspects. Aria's bestiary has 112 entries for every enemy in the game, and among those are 110 abilities that the player character can use, split into 4 categories. Permanent abilities are gray souls instead of relics, and in one menu you can switch out red, blue, and yellow souls. Red souls are the new sub-weapons. Hold up and press attack to use a red soul attack. Most are projectiles, much like classic Castlevania sub-weapons. These souls are the most plentiful in the game, with 55 to collect. Or you can just leave it up to chance and use what you get. Blue souls are activated with the R button, and generally fall under the category of familiars. There are 24 of them. Lastly, yellow souls are passive souls, all of which just tweak stats one way or the other, whether that's directly increasing strength, dropping shop prices, or making rotten food heal instead of hurt. There are 35 yellow souls to find. There are also the 6 ability souls and 5 souls, 3 blue and 2 yellow, that are obtained from canisters instead of enemies. Aria also shines when it comes to variety of weapons and weapon classes. In Symphony there are many types of weapons, but almost all of them use the same sword/slash animation. And Harmony has the one whip attack that you use for the whole game. Aria draws inspiration in this area from Circle of the Moon, which as part of its magic system includes 8 elemental whip attacks and 8 completely unique weapon attacks. In Aria, main weapons can be short swords and long swords with the same type of slash animation as Alucards from Symphony, but there are also overhead swinging swords, stabby lances and partisans, and some guns too. Also just like in Symphony of the Night, heavy weapons can be felt by an air attack not instantly canceling itself when the player character touches the ground. The main weapon variety in Aria is so great that it makes the previous games all feel lacking. Another aspect of Aria's elegance is its conciseness. This game has the smallest game world map, but it does this without feeling smaller or less grand. In fact, some areas, the underground waterway in particular, are sprawling just like the equivalent cave-themed area in Symphony of the Night. Sometimes less is more in Castlevania map level design, or at very least, less can be as effective as more. The last thing you'd want in your Igavania map is a giant castle map filled mostly by simple, rectangular hallways, and luckily Aria saves itself from this fate. The worst offenders of Hallwayvania are Harmony of Dissonance and Portrait of Ruin, unless you want to consider the PlayStation 2 games, which personally I never do. Just like all previous games, especially Symphony, Aria spends most of its effort expanding on what's most important. The player character is almost always at the center of the screen, so it follows that the player character should be the most beautifully animated sprite in the game. Aria's player sprite of Soma Cruz walking is 19 frames long, the longest of any of these games. Wow, someone had to draw this. Noriaki Yamamoto drew this. Across Soma's hair, there's a single pixel of shine that flows in his walk cycle. Gorgeous. I'm not done gushing about this game, by the way. Aria of Sorrow's bonus character mode is one of the best in the series. Julius mode is nuts. Julius is fast and smooth and strong and fun,
Bonus unlockable character done right. I love his red pants. Only a few months ago, 2023 saw wild new speedrunning discoveries for Julius mode. Julius is so fast and smooth, in fact, that he can clip through corners and acquire multiple Castlevania boss orbs from bosses, which crucially level Julius up in his game mode. One double orb technique has been known for years, but it turns out that with frame-perfect precision, Julius can get 2 or more orbs from almost every boss fight. Soma has to fight Julius as a boss to reach the true ending, and even if Soma brings a gun, Julius still might win the fight, especially in the new hard mode. Harmony of Dissonance has so many bosses that it split them up into 4 difficulties for the boss rush modes, but Aria is the first game to have both a normal mode and an unlockable hard mode usable in the main game and Julius mode. You can even finish your first playthrough and then play hard mode in New Game Plus, meaning that you keep all your non-progression souls and items. Hard mode even has some new items for Soma, unique weapons and armor that you can't obtain in normal mode. Aria also has unique Soma weapons for getting good clear times in the boss rush. The Game Boy Advance Castlevania trilogy was released on Wii U in October 2014, and again in the Advance Collection by M2 in 2021. Aria is the only game in the trilogy to have a feature that isn't emulated in either of the 2 re-releases, and it's a multiplayer one. Right on the main menu, with a GBA link cable, you can trade souls with another Castlevania player, just like Pokemon. In the Advance Collection, M2 went to the trouble to remove the option from the menu, but in the Wii U release, the soul trade menu is still accessible, just as if you were playing on a Game Boy Advance without a link cable.
Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow released in 2005 for Nintendo DS. Dawn of Sorrow is a direct sequel to the previous game, Aria of Sorrow, made by mostly the same people. DS games released in the first few years of the system's life have a reputation for being experimental with the system's new features, namely 2 screens, and the bottom one being a touchscreen. Dawn of Sorrow is no exception, despite it being an action platformer perfectly suited to more traditional control schemes. The 2-screen thing is used as more of a convenience. Enemy names no longer appear on the game screen itself, instead only on the top screen, along with plenty of other stats that in the previous games you could only see in the pause menu. Not only that, but the select button, instead of being the dedicated map button, now toggles the top screen between showing these stats and showing the map. Having the map semi-permanently visible during gameplay is a fine enough use for the DS's second screen. More interesting is how Dawn of Sorrow copes with having a fancy new touchscreen. In Dawn of Sorrow, while playing the main game mode, boss fights do not end when the boss's health value reaches 0. Instead, at the end of boss fights, the game stops and a magic seal must be drawn with a particular pattern on the touchscreen. This must be done within a time limit. If the player fails to draw the magic seal to the game's expectations, the boss gains some extra health. The player continues the boss fight and whittles down its health value in order to have another try at the magic seal. This magic seal mechanic has always been the most contentious aspect of Dawn of Sorrow. It's also precisely the sort of mechanic that makes people go, oh, that Castlevania DS trilogy is never getting re-released. Beyond the magic seals, the rest of the game is undeniably solid. After Aria of Sorrow ended up being on average the second easiest game in this series, only beaten by Symphony of the Night, Dawn of Sorrow confidently delivers the type of difficulty that Castlevania is known for. Dawn of Sorrow has the same soul system from Aria, where every enemy has a chance to drop its soul, granting the player character an ability uniquely from that specific enemy. Like any normal rare item drop in an RPG, but a little more Kirby. There are 2 major alterations Dawn makes to this soul system. The first is that some soul abilities can level up, requiring you to either randomly obtain or farm multiple of the same soul. If you really love one particular ability, and in the equipment menu it lists a power level of 1/3 or 1/5 or 1/9, you can choose to max out its potential by good old RPG grinding. Luckily, this is not required at all, if all you want is the special item reward for collecting 100% souls. One of each is just fine. The other new feature embedded into the soul system is a new type of shop, specializing in weapon synthesis. Dawn of Sorrow retains the weapon classes that Aria had, and you can find the weakest level of most of these weapons simply lying around near the start of the game. Each class of weapon has an upgrade tree, and all it costs to upgrade a weapon is 1 preset soul. The power level of the new weapon is always about spot on compared to where the player is in the game, including availability of the enemy soul needed for the trade.
This type of upgrade tree is completely new for the series, and the layout of Dawn of Sorrow's world map is built well to synergize with the upgrade paths. In the first 50 minutes or so of the game, you already have access to 3 warp points that take you back to both the weapon synthesis shop and the normal shop. Just like in Aria, visiting the shop often is encouraged to restock on healing items and to see what new items are for sale. But in Dawn, these trips also include checking in on your weapons and reminding yourself what enemy souls you need for an upgrade. The best wrinkle in this new system is the trade-off between keeping a useful soul ability or giving it up for more raw damage output in the form of an upgraded main weapon. It's good stuff. The DS's slight screen resolution increase compared to the Game Boy Advance allowed the developers to use the same character size proportions as in Symphony of the Night, which let them partake in a great Castlevania tradition, reusing assets from previous games. Enemy models like the Bat from Symphony of the Night and the Purple Armor Knight from Rondo of Blood fit right in. And why stop there? Alucard is a character present in the Sorrow games, so playable Alucard should be a part of Dawn's Julius mode. Julius mode in Dawn is much more fleshed out than any previous bonus character mode. You control Julius, Yoko, and Alucard, and can switch between them with one button, Castlevania 3 style. This whole mode thematically is like a revival of the Castlevania 3 team. Dawn also expands on the multiplayer options in the series. No co-op mode yet, but on top of the soul trade returning from Aria, Dawn adds an enemy set mode, where you can pack a short gauntlet of challenge rooms with enemies based on what enemy souls you've obtained in your playthrough. You can then send these rooms wirelessly to a friend for them to try. A weird inclusion that most players will likely find no interest in, but for the one player out of 1,000 who would love it, it's there. Castlevania Portrait of Ruin released in 2006 for Nintendo DS. At the time, this was the 5th game in this Castlevania genre subseries released in the past 6 years. No matter what new features Portrait boasted, it shouldn't have been able to combat franchise fatigue. It somehow did. Portrait reviewed and sold almost as well as Dawn of Sorrow. In many ways, the new interesting stuff in Portrait is all a result of rearranging and expanding on game mechanics and systems present in Dawn. The biggest things Portrait brought to show and tell are having 2 characters present for the whole game, 1 character switch button away, who both have different strengths, and the levels in the game reaching further away from Dracula's castle. The character switching is mostly new, but the foundation of the system was set with Dawn's Julius mode and the 3 characters present there. Jonathan and Charlotte specialize mostly in physical and magical attacks respectively, but unfortunately, this game is not Ikaruga. Seemingly little care was put into the balance of attack elemental weaknesses, meaning Jonathan is the real main character and Charlotte is mostly a support character, unless you want to try a difficult Charlotte-only challenge run. The game world expanding beyond Dracula's castle is definitely new, but it too stems from Dawn of Sorrow with its Abyss area, which was so large that the developers saw fit to give it its own separate castle map. Aria also has a similar endgame area called the Chaotic Realm, but that one thematically does not count for map completion, and the whole area displays a blank map if you check it. Portrait having many areas separated from the castle is a pretty cool way to expand on physical space in the game world and to vary the types of environments that the game takes place in. In a 2006 interview translated by Shmuplations, Iga stated that he was getting antsy to get outdoors, and this is why Portrait has so many more outdoor areas. There are 2 downsides to this game having so much game world to traverse. The first is that it removes the cohesiveness of exploring one large, interconnected map, and the second is that the level design is uninspired. More than any other game in the series, except maybe the PlayStation 2 games, Portrait's rooms are mostly square, with wide open spaces for the fighting of enemies to take place. Even areas that look cool in terms of their design almost all have the same shape to them. There is one upside to this downside though. Portrait of Ruin is one of the best action platformer games on the DS. Portrait's combat is very fun, and the player who seeks more depth in Castlevania combat will be happy to find it here. Fighting game motion inputs return for Jonathan, the main character, and 3 out of 5 of the bonus characters too. Richter mode Richter even has some brand new motion input moves that he didn't have in Symphony of the Night's bonus Richter mode. It was only on this, my 4th playthrough of Portrait, that I realized that the heaviest weapon attacks can be cancelled out of using the flying knee fighting game input move. Finding stuff like this is really rewarding and fun, but unfortunately in the case of Portrait, players may easily miss out on it by only sticking with the basics. In the main game, another mechanic from Dawn was rearranged. Jonathan's sub-weapons are not souls like in the Sorrow games, but some do drop from enemies, and others can be obtained from the shop or as quest rewards. Instead of sub-weapons leveling up with multiples of the same soul like in Dawn, Jonathan's sub-weapons themselves have experience points. Each sub-weapon starts out quite weak, but if you deal finishing blows to enough enemies with your favorite sub-weapon, it will grow stronger and eventually hit its top level, called Mastery. This coincides with a steep increase in power, and usually a visual change to the subweapon. If you fully level up the paper plane, the planes become koitsu from Parodius. Each subweapon has its own threshold to mastery, and just as every enemy has its own experience stat that it grants on each kill, they also have unique subweapon mastery point values. I can tell you from experience that the weapon mastery system only works if you pay attention to it. Based on my prior experience with the Castlevania series, when I first played Portrait, I only really ever used subweapons on boss fights, so I never saw them get stronger. Portrait is an action game filled to the brim with numbers, more in-your-face statistics on every screen than any other of these games. This is the first game since Symphony of the Night to list total enemy kill count, but Portrait goes the extra mile and tells you how many of each individual enemy you've felled. The characters level up, there are so many armor and accessory items that change stats, and now the sub-weapons have their own level ups. Players often know if they're being manipulated to feel a certain way, just like the same that might happen to a movie watcher. And when making a movie or a game, you do your best to not rub your audience the wrong way. If a game is so oversaturated with numbers that go up, it risks being seen by some players as a popcorn game, a snack food game, or worse, uninteresting. This is really tragic in my opinion, because as an action game, Portrait of Ruin might just be the game with the second most mechanical depth, only behind Symphony of the Night. Here's yet another rearranged mechanic from Dawn, an NPC quest giver and quest reward giver. In Dawn, the weapon synthesis shop acted sort of as a quest dispenser, but all of the quests were simply to obtain the souls of particular enemies. Portrait's quests do include retrieving rare item drops from enemies, but also practicing fighting game motion inputs to unlock more, getting a negative status effect, and other incidental happenings, like going to the room with a big clock when your DS's system clock hits noon or midnight. The quests in Portrait are fine, mostly excuses to nudge players into backtracking to old areas and spending more time there. The rewards are often really useful, especially if you press A twice to accept the reward, and then press Start instead of any other button to quit the quest menu, which does not clear the quest reward as being received, meaning you can endlessly duplicate reward items. This is a great way to have enough money to buy every expensive item in the shop without having to grind at all. It feels very similar to soul item duplication in Demon's Souls or Dark Souls 1 to me. Brand new in Portrait is a co-op boss rush mode. 2 players can each pick a character and play the boss rush together. This idea would later be expanded into a whole game, Castlevania Harmony of Despair, for Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation 3. Harmony of Despair is equal parts tasteful, joyous celebration of this series and subpar budget game. A fine co-op concept, but miserable alone. At least its music is great. Castlevania Order of Ecclesia released in 2008 for Nintendo DS. Order of Ecclesia is great. It is no doubt one of the most polished games in this series, and it tries as hard as it can to stand out. Ecclesia has one of the most stylish soundtracks, one of the coolest Dracula fights, one of the coolest bonus character modes, and it even has side quests that are actually good. Here's how they achieved that. Like all of the previous games in this series except Circle of the Moon, Order of Ecclesia has a bad ending and then more content and a better ending that requires some extra work to see. In Ecclesia, this comes in the form of 13 kidnapped villagers that protagonist Shinoa saves. More villagers saved gives you access to more quests and quest rewards, and the boss that triggers the bad ending is a serious difficulty spike. This gives the player a great opportunity to do villager quests. And when you do see the bad ending, it gives glimpses of the locations of the remaining villagers, so even villagers hidden behind breakable walls are findable. Saving all 13 of them is the action that allows you to pass the bad ending and see the rest of the game. It's a pretty well thought out and executed system. The separate areas level setup returns from Portrait and is expanded with the help of an overworld map. You don't even get to enter Dracula's castle until you pass the threshold for getting the good ending. Most of the game until that point takes place in areas surrounding the little town that acts as a home base. After Aria of Sorrow combined the heart counter and magic meter into one resource, every game since has done the same, until Order of Ecclesia. Ecclesia has other unorthodox plans for the magic meter. In Ecclesia, all normal weapons are magical glyphs that the protagonist wields, so every swing of a sword uses up some magic. To compensate, magic refills very quickly in this game. Ecclesia starts with a mandatory tutorial that goes over equipping weapons, attacking, and using glyph unions, which are the new sub-weapons, and are back to using hearts as ammunition. The tutorial doesn't exist to explain the stamina bar, absorbing and equipping glyphs, or glyph unions. The tutorial exists to show off what the game calls combos.
You have two main attack buttons corresponding to the protagonist's left and right hands, just like in Symphony of the Night, and the recovery frames of attacks can be cancelled out of by alternating attacking with each hand. In the previous Igavanias, attacking was semi-committal, but you could always skip the waiting period at the end of attack animations by backdashing or landing on the ground if the weapon auto-cancels on the ground. These small changes compared to classic Castlevania games sped up the combat significantly. In Rondo of Blood, one of the very best of the classic Vania genre of Castlevania game, attacking is such a committal option that when fighting against death, the boss reacts to being hit every single time. Most bosses in Igavania games don't work like this. If they staggered like this, they would be overpowered by the faster combat mechanics. And I'm telling you all this now to put in context that the combo system in Order of Ecclesia changes combat in a fundamental way. You quickly get used to rolling your thumb back and forth across the attack buttons. Ecclesia having such unique combat is definitely one of the reasons why fans of Ecclesia love Ecclesia. There aren't any other games quite like it. This game has two optional secret areas, a combat dungeon and a platforming dungeon. The combat dungeon, Large Cavern, is a lot like the Nest of Evil from Portrait of Ruin, a similar optional enemy gauntlet area. Surprisingly few of these games have areas such as these. Portrait was the first to have this type of thing since Circle of the Moon's Battle Arena. The platforming dungeon in Ecclesia, the training hall, is unique and refreshing. The classic Castlevania genre, or the classic Vania games, are all about strategic, cautious combat encounters built into strategic, cautious platforming challenges. The Metroidvania series, starting with Symphony of the Night, with its items and weapons and stats that all bolster the combat, never really tried to combine all that with the platforming challenges that the old games pull off very well. Iga has stated in interviews that many of the developers working on Symphony agreed that instant death pits were their least favorite part of the old Castlevania games. This platforming dungeon in Ecclesia, the training hall, dips its toes into actual platforming challenges for the first time in a long time. Circle of the Moon, the only game in this set with no involvement from Iga, arguably does a better job balancing platforming and combat gameplay than most of the rest, and the training hall's background graphics and level tile set seem to directly pull from Circle of the Moon stylistically as sort of a nod. The reward for getting through the Large Cavern is a nightmarishly difficult optional boss fight, and the reward for seeing the end of the training hall is Redire, a main weapon glyph that does pitiful damage but flies in a strange arc and, as its description notes, is magnetic. The first movement-related ability you find in Ecclesia is Magnus, an ability that lets you use magnetism to fling the protagonist around, and used with Redire, it creates a super odd but learnable method for flight. I held off on playing randomizers of Dawn of Sorrow and Portrait of Ruin to play an Order of Ecclesia one instead. The DS-Vania randomizer by Lago Lunatic can randomize all three games in the DS trilogy. It has some killer features, like being able to generate completely randomized map layouts and starting points, randomize all sorts of gameplay statistics, randomize skill graphics, cut the magic seal mechanic from Dawn of Sorrow, and more. I ended up having so much fun playing the Order of Ecclesia randomizer that I went ahead and played a Dawn run and a Portrait run, too. Ritual of the Night released in 2019 for PC, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch, in 2020 for iOS, Android, and Amazon Luna, and in 2021 for Google Stadia. In May 2015, a website called swordorwhip.com suddenly appeared and got some coverage from game journalism. Iga, who had recently left Konami, was teasing a new project. A few days later, the Kickstarter campaign for Bloodstained Ritual of the Night went live. Inspired by Keiji Inafune's Kickstarter crowdfunded Mighty No. 9, a spiritual successor to Mega Man, Bloodstained was to be the grand return of the 2D Metroidvania-style Castlevania. The only reason it's called Ritual of the Night is to bring to mind Symphony of the Night, the most famous and highest regarded of these games. The only reason this new franchise is called Bloodstained is because stained glass was decided on as a motif for the game, because stained glass is cool. With the help of Fangamer, a company that does game merch, and Digital Development Management, a video game agency that previously helped run Mighty No. 9's Kickstarter campaign, Bloodstained took off. Still today, in 2023, Bloodstained holds the title of second most funded video game Kickstarter campaign, only behind Yu Suzuki's Shenmue 3.
Well, congratulations. You got yourself caught. Now, what's the next step of your master plan?
One of the 64,867 Bloodstained backers is me. Suffering from success, during the fundraising campaign, new stretch goals were added and reached, promising boatloads of new content and features in Bloodstained. A few of these were freebies, like a new boss or a boss rush mode, but others were more lofty. A classic mode side game, a prequel game for handheld systems, and even Wii U and PlayStation Vita ports were all goals met during the campaign. One of the original plans was that Inti Creates, the developers of the Mega Man Zero series and Mega Man 9 and 10, would develop Bloodstained, but this didn't happen. Instead, Inti Creates handled the prequel spin-off title, which became Bloodstained Curse of the Moon. Just like with Mega Man 9 and 10 in 2008 and 2010, new classic-era Mega Man games, Inti Creates got to make, essentially, a new classic Castlevania with Curse of the Moon. Curse of the Moon released in 2018 for Nintendo 3DS, Nintendo Switch, PC, PlayStation 4, PlayStation Vita, and Xbox One, beating out Ritual of the Night by a year, and in that sense being the beginning of the franchise. Curse of the Moon is fantastic. It's a short game so fine-tuned and with just enough options that it's endlessly replayable. There are 27 routes you can take while playing the main mode, and a 28th route with a unique final stage called Nightmare Mode is like a built-in sequel, unlocked after playing through the most obvious normal mode route. Such a good game. So good that this spin-off got its own sequel, Bloodstained Curse of the Moon 2, released in 2020 for all the same platforms except 3DS and Vita. That one's weirder. A corgi drives a steampunk mech that kind of destroys the balance of the game by being the obviously most valuable character.
Hachi. A corgi.
Curse of the Moon 2 does have really fun local co-op multiplayer, though. While the first Curse of the Moon was being developed, Iga and his team at Artplay, his new development studio, toiled away at Ritual of the Night. With the communication line of the Kickstarter campaign, many backer updates were given throughout development. At E3 2016, a demo of Ritual was shown off, and backers got to play this beta build from the comfort of their own homes. The first backer demo only included the first area and boss of the game, but for E3 2018, a second backer demo was released, including the first 2 hours or so. Being so close to not just fans, but also the people who pre-ordered the game in 2015 allowed the game's marketing to be pretty out there compared to other anticipated titles. Leading up to release, one major trailer for Ritual displays internet posts of people dissing the look of the game, followed by footage of Iga exclaiming that they will make it right, and then a side-by-side montage of scenes from Ritual of the Night showing a major graphical overhaul. These things can be normal for a video game trailer if you crowdsource your game and it ends up with a budget of $5.5 million. In 2017, the Wii U port of Ritual of the Night was pronounced cancelled, and development efforts on that front would go toward a Nintendo Switch port instead. This was decided upon during the first month of the Switch's release. Later, in 2018, the PlayStation Vita port was cancelled due to support for the Vita vanishing. The Nintendo Switch is, despite being a handheld system, more capable than the Wii U in the ways that are important for computer hardware specialized to run video games. Ritual of the Night was built with Unreal Engine 4, which you'd hope would help at least a little with porting the game to different platforms. Dragon Quest XI's Echoes of an Elusive Age runs well on the Switch, and was also using the power of Unreal Engine 4. Unfortunately, the Switch port of Ritual of the Night did not fare so well. On release, it was an absolute mess. Low resolution, high input delay, and long pauses for loading between rooms plagued the Switch port of Ritual at launch and really brought it down. The Switch version launched 1 week later than all other platforms, and whatever the case for that was, it still wasn't really ready at launch. The good news is that over the course of a few weeks, some of the issues, namely the input delay, were improved drastically with update patches. You can't fault the developers for not trying to make it perform the best they could. It's still the weakest way to play Ritual of the Night, but it is playable. And despite the lower texture resolution, lower screen resolution, lower frame rate, and everything else, it still receives all new updates. That's the silver lining to the Switch version of Ritual of the Night, that it hasn't been abandoned. It still is the full game. You'd have to imagine that with the popularity of the Nintendo Switch, a large portion of Ritual of the Night's sales are the Switch version, and that feels a little weird somehow, but it is what it is. Ritual of the Night reuses the popular soul system from the Sorrow games. Absorbing the souls of enemies has been swapped out for being impaled by magical crystal shards. The 3 souls from the Sorrow games even retain their color, red for the standard Castlevania subweapon souls, blue for souls that activate with the R1 button, and yellow for passive stat-changing souls. Bloodstained augments this with 2 new soul slots, purple shards for directional attacks, which are ranged attacks much like the red shards but aimed with the right analog stick, and green shards, which are familiars. In the Sorrow games, familiars were all blue souls, but in Symphony, familiars were switched out in the relics menu, so a new shard color acts as a natural middle ground. more elegantly adding Symphony's always active familiars into the soul system. Shards are crazy in this game. Just like in Dawn of Sorrow, farming multiple of the same soul powers up the ability, up to a cap of 9, but there's a new layer to this in Ritual. One of the side quest NPCs is the alchemist Johannes, who can power up shard abilities with the right items. This type of powering up shards can also be applied multiple times, and the recipe changes to rarer items as the power level goes up. This is a level of grinding never before seen in this series, but it's only really necessary to fight the two optional super bosses of the game, the Alucard-like vampire and the Dracula-like vampire, who is literally Iga, producer and scenario writer of this game. Ritual also has fighting game motion input moves, now called techniques. Like spells in Symphony, these do drain MP, but unlike Symphony, they aren't globally usable. Instead, techniques are tied to specific weapons, much like the near-invisible weapon special system in Symphony. They also have a bit of the weapon mastery system from Portrait in there, as performing a weapon technique enough times will unlock it for all weapons of that type, whether it's kick shoes, short swords, or any other. Unfortunately for this robust technique system, MP is almost always better used throwing out shard attacks instead. The coolest technique is one shared by the Shoes weapon class, which you can use to reach further places than you'd think, early in the game, before you have access to double jump or flight. Just chain a few Hadokens together and you can get some glide out of it. NPC side quests return from Ecclesia, and come in all sorts of flavors, sorted by the type of quest. One woman shows you her hit list of arbitrary numbers of specific enemies that she wants dead. Another requires gifts of specific items to honor the town's dead. And one guy accepts corn seed, and if you leave and come back later, he'll give you delicious corn. There's also a clown who keeps getting lost in the demon castle, and requires a waystone item to try to get home. He gives the protagonist an increasing amount of money for the trouble. One woman just sits around and wants you to deliver her pizza and fries. More than any other game in this series, this game is almost too big, almost too full of stuff, almost overstuffed. Bloodstained having the largest castle map was a stretch goal met, and whether that's true or not, I don't really care. Its map is bigger than Symphony's castle, but not if you include the inverted castle. The map is weird in this one, with Ritual of the Night being the first game in this set to be presented in 16:9 aspect ratio. I guess it was decided that one game screen being represented by one square map tile wouldn't look natural anymore. And so, Ritual's map tiles are each 16:9 rectangles. If we calculate map size by volume of all rooms, then Ritual wins for largest map, but again, I don't think that actually matters for much. For fun, here's what Ritual's map might have looked like if it used square map tiles like all the others. This was Ritual of the Night in 2019 on release. Since then, updates have been slowly rolled out, delivering on features promised by the stretch goals. The roguelike dungeon stretch goal was replaced with a randomizer mode, which was a great idea all around. Roguelike Metroidvania games were sort of falling out of fashion at the time, and fan-made randomizer mods for all sorts of games, including several of the games already discussed in this series, were becoming increasingly popular. The wording of a roguelike dungeon tells me that it was likely intended to be similar to the Chalice dungeons from FromSoft's Bloodborne, and a randomizer mode about shuffling items around is just a better use of development resources. It suits games with Metroidvania item progressions very well. New characters were added. First, a Zangetsu mode, a traditional post-game unlockable second character for this series. But we also have Bloodless mode, a playable boss character mode who has her own Metroidvania item progression and an all-new hand-tuned difficulty scaling, since her starting point is her boss room in the middle of the castle. The newest added character is a third-party guest character, Aurora, the protagonist from the 2014 Ubisoft game Child of Light. Since 2019, 2 new areas have been added to Bloodstained. One, a single room with a boss, a tie-in with an indie game called Kingdom 2 Crowns, and the second is a small area inspired by the game Journey. A boss revenge mode was the final stretch goal incentive, which ended up being a short boss rush challenge mode featuring 4 playable demon boss characters up against the human characters. It's okay. One of the coolest new modes added is the Classic mode, a full new Classicvania genre game built into Ritual of the Night as a side mode. This game, which was developed by WayForward, the studio known for the Shantae series, is basically a full reimagining of Castlevania 1 for NES. Every third room or so in the game remakes exact level design scenarios from Castlevania 1, which is very fun if you're like me and have played through the first Castlevania 50 times. It also shows a lot of respect to Castlevania 1 for having such carefully and well-crafted levels in 1986. Classic mode has a very different feel from Inti Create's Curse of the Moon Classicvania games, which I appreciate a lot. The biggest problem with new Classicvania games is that sometimes they make me feel like I'm 500 years old. These games feel very niche now, much more so than the Metroidvania type games, which is kind of odd since the now monolithic FromSoft games owe so much to them. Unfortunately, marketing classic Vania games like
It's like 2D Dark Souls
seems ineffective in getting younger people into them. Anyway, a sequel to Ritual of the Night's classic mode is in development right now, so that should be fun. The next updates coming to Ritual of the Night are to be the local and online versus mode and co-op mode. What you're looking at right now is the June 2022 development roadmap. The new crossover area in the corner ended up being the Journey one. The Bloodstained journey started in 2015, and in 2023 it's still not done. Despite this, it's evident that Ritual of the Night lands squarely in the camp of video game Kickstarter successes. The developers have already delivered on the concept of Ritual, a monstrous amalgamation of all the favorite mechanics across the series, living in one cohesive game. For a loud, fan-funded return to form after a long absence, Ritual of the Night had to be this way, and if nothing else, it's stronger for it. Ritual is like an all-stars pack of Igavania goodness. Ritual of the Night started with the question of sword or whip, but the Ritual of the Night that released took one of everything from the buffet. Maybe next time we'll get a game more unique, like Order of Ecclesia, more new instead of iterating on what we already know works. In 2021, Artplay announced that they were in the planning stages of a sequel to Ritual of the Night. We can only speculate on how such a small development team is faring, balancing a new project with finalizing all of the extra content for Ritual. Meanwhile, Konami is developing new Castlevania, Metal Gear, and Silent Hill games themselves, but what this probably means is that Konami is aiding and funding the studios who are developing these titles. The new Metal Gear and Silent Hill games in question have been unveiled with teaser trailers, but whatever is next for Castlevania still hasn't been publicly shown off. IGA and Artplay could be working on the new Castlevania right now. Or anybody else. Konami recently helped the indie studio Guru Guru produce Getsu Fumaden Undying Moon, a new game in what is sort of a sister franchise to Castlevania. Through a year-long contest, Konami awarded the La Mulana developers the opportunity to make a new game in the long-dormant Maze of Gallius series. Who knows what's next? Time will tell.
Years go by. Then the morning.
See? I told you I'd get you into the old man's secret hideaway.
Looks like dear old dad is out to lunch.